My name's Kristi Scharmer. I am currently living just outside of Drayton, North Dakota, and have been for a little over 30 years. I grew up in Gatsky, Minnesota, back many years ago.
Okay, so that's the connection with Del Rey, huh? Larson?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Okay.
He and my dad played baseball together when I was little. Baseball was a big thing at the time, Independent Men's Baseball League, and church and all that small town country stuff. So that's how I know pretty much anybody that's at Gatsby now, still. I grew up on a farm, and I had one brother, and my dad always talked about the military and the Army. He really enjoyed his time in the Army, and if he would have been able to, he would have stayed in the Army longer. But his dad passed away, and so he came home to take care of the farm, and that's how I ended up living where I did. I was actually born on Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota, as was my brother, because Dad was stationed at a little Army missile battery just outside of Rapid City, and that's how we ended up in that area. And then after I was born, we moved to someplace in Illinois for a very few months, and then when his dad passed away, we moved back to Gatsky, and I lived there until I grew up and went off to college.
Okay.
And partly because of all the talking he did about the military, and my brother and my uncle and I used to play Army all the time. Part of that, and then his brother was active duty Army, and I had an uncle on my mom's side that had been in the Vietnam War, and another uncle on my dad's side that was a Korean War vet. It just, I don't know, I grew up with military in my background, a lot of patriotism and love for country. And I told my mom when I was 4 years old that I was going to be an Army nurse someday. And it came to pass. And I think another reason for that is because there was a lady in our town, and as I was getting a little older and understanding history more and that kind of stuff, I found out that she was a nurse during World War II in Burma. And it just, I don't know. She became one of my heroes, I guess you could say, because I just thought that was so cool and what an interesting life that might be. And so just as I grew up and as I got to be thinking, what am I going to do with the rest of my life, I did decide to go into nursing. So I went to college at UND, and then it was the last semester I was in college that I went to a careers fair. And while I was there, they had recruiters from the different services, and my dad was Army, all my uncles were Army, and then I had a relative who was also a career Air Force person. And so the Air Force tried to get me, but I said no, it would have to be Army. And so I filled out the paperwork and started the process. And then I finished college and got sworn in. It was my uncle Wayne Lunsetter who actually commissioned me. My recruiter was going to be getting out of recruiting, and he wanted to commission me before he got off of the job. And he said, I can get it done in Thief River Falls, but all I need is somebody who is active or retired, major or above, to swear you in. And I said, well, I have an uncle that I'm sure would be happy to do it. And he said, you think so? And I said, oh, I think that shouldn't be much of a problem. And so
You're lucky she's sober.
twice. And so I called him up, and of course that wasn't an issue. So we went to the recruiting office in Thief River in February of 1983, and Uncle Wayne swore me in. Of course, Mom and Dad were there, and my Aunt Barb. And so I got commissioned. I'm going to step back just a little bit because I've got to tell this story. When I was growing up, my dad, as I said, talked a lot about the military. And I'm sorry, he whispered something in my ear and threw me off track. But he had always talked about the military and how much he liked it, and how much he believed everyone should have at least 2 years active service in the military. That was his philosophy. But everybody should go in as an enlisted person, according to him. So when I did decide to go in the Army, I had told my mom separately, and then Dad and I happened to go to a football game at my old high school that evening. And so at the football game on the sidelines, I said, Dad, I'm joining the Army. And he said, oh, really? As what? And I said, I'm going in as a second lieutenant. And he said, well, you know how I feel about that. And I said, yes, I do, but they're offering me a commission and I'm not turning it down. And he said, no, I guess I understand that. He doesn't remember this conversation at all. I remember it very distinctly.
They were probably both drunk.
Why? Stop it.
So you were commissioned as a first lieutenant.
Second
lieutenant, and that was because you had a college education?
Correct.
You weren't an ROTC or anything like that, right?
No.
Okay.
I had this Air Force relative was trying to talk me into ROTC, and I said, at that time, I don't want to go in the military. And then, like I said, my last semester, I decided, well, maybe I should go in the military. And part of the reason for doing this was I was somebody who grew up very close to my family and very dependent on my family, and I knew somehow I had to break those ties. And I also knew that by being in the military, my ability to go home all the time and that kind of stuff wasn't going to be there. And so it was kind of a way to make me become more independent. Was my reasoning, part of my reasoning behind it. And so that's what I did. But in the meantime, I was right after college, I got a job at the hospital that was still open in Carlstead, Minnesota. And I worked there until I passed my state boards, because I couldn't go active duty until I passed my state boards.
Were you a nurse now, or?
Yes, I was a nurse.
Okay.
Yep. And I graduated in December of '82 is what I did. And so then I was living and working in Carlstead, and then I suddenly met this man who I fell in love with, and we had a whirlwind courtship. We got married about 2.5 months after we met. And when he proposed, I said, what about the Army? And he said, well, women follow their husbands all the time. Why can't I go with you? And I said, I don't have a problem with that if you don't. And he said, no, I don't. So we got married the end of July in '83, and then I passed my boards in earlier that month. I took my boards for the second time, and then I found out in August then that I passed them. So my entry date to active duty was in October. So about 2 months after we got married, 3 months after we got married, I left him for 6 weeks to go down to San Antonio to Officer Basic and get started on my military career. did 6 weeks of active duty, or 6 weeks of officer basic in San Antonio at Fort Sam Houston. That's where they do, where the Army primarily does any of their medical training, is Fort Sam Houston. And then I was going to be stationed in Hawaii, and I wanted him to fly over with me at the same time, and of course paperwork got all mixed up. And he was already down in San Antonio. He came down the last couple days of basic. And, excuse me.
So basic, Kristi, so basic, that was nursing training? Is that what it was? Or did you actually go through some basic?
It was, it's not basic training as enlisted people know what basic training is, but it's learning the ins and outs of being in the military and being an officer in the military. So it's learning to march, it's learning to salute, it's you did some work with weapons. The first 3 weeks at that time was focused on nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare, because it was still Cold War time, and you needed to know all that stuff. And it kind of hits you in the face fast when your first 3 weeks of training are on NBC. And we did the tent, taking off the mask. We did that thing, learning how to do the gear, the MOP gear, learning how to what medications to take, how to use your emergency kit for NBC, all of that kind of stuff. We did, the interesting thing was your PT was on your own. We didn't have organized physical training, physical PT, which was a big mistake because by the time I had to take my first PT test in Hawaii, I was not ready for that. But anyway, that's primarily what it was learning the rules and regulations and how to conduct yourself.
What was the food like there?
It was actually, we lived in the bachelor officers' quarters, so it was pretty much food on your own.
There's no mess tent, no mess hall or anything like that?
No. Not that I remember, and I could be remembering that wrong, but I mostly remember cooking in the BOQ or, going out to restaurants or that kind of thing. I don't really remember going into a mess tent. Maybe for the noon meal it was, but this was also, like I said, on Fort Sam Houston, and so if I remember right, if we did any food, it was at the hospital, but I could be getting mixed up with my reserve trips down to Fort Sam Houston too. So,
okay.
Because I have spent a lot of time down in Fort Sam Houston. So, and then, let's see. Yeah. That's mostly what I remember of basic training and what we did there. And then, like I said, paperwork got mixed up, and so I had to take advanced leave in order to get the orders recut and the travel part redone so that Dwight and I could travel over to Hawaii together. So in the meantime, we drove back home. By now it's December and getting close to Christmas, and this would be my first Christmas away from home. And we didn't tell anybody that we were coming home before we headed over to Hawaii. And so we drove back home, and we first surprised his mom here in Drayton, and then we went out to Gatsky and surprised my parents and my brother. And when my brother saw me, I think he was the first one to see me, and he grabbed me and hugged me, and he said, "Oh, I'm so glad you came. She's been crying all morning." My mom had been missing me and thinking about Christmas without me and that kind of stuff. And so it was a nice surprise for them, and it was fun for me because of being so close to my family to be able to see them one more time before we went overseas.
Right. Yep.
So then after that, we drove out to Los Angeles and got the car shipped. And it was interesting because at that time, credit cards weren't that big of a deal. And neither Dwight or I had a credit card. And the company that was going to ship the car didn't want to do it without a credit card. But they found out I was military.
No, Kristi, they wouldn't let us rent the car.
Oh, I'm sorry. They wouldn't let us rent the car without a credit card that we were going to need to use to go, that we were going to use after we had shipped the car, because we had to ship the car like 3 or 4 days before we even left Los Angeles. And so they weren't going to let us rent the car without a credit card. But when they found out I was in the Army, they knew that they would get my money one way or another if there was a problem. And so they just took a copy of my orders, and then they were okay with renting us the car. So once we got over to Hawaii, one of the first things we did was went to a bank, established an account, and got a credit card so that we wouldn't run into issues with that again. When we got to Hawaii, we stayed in the guest house at Fort Shafter, which is right next to Tripler Army Medical Center, where I was going to be stationed. And then while I'm getting all of the in-processing done and that kind of stuff, Dwight went looking for a place for us to live. And we got an apartment. Because getting housing on post was so difficult, we got a apartment just down the hill in the local community and just ended up staying there the whole time. Interestingly enough, of course, Hawaii and Oahu is a big military place, and with lots of Air Force, Army, Navy around, Marine Corps. So all of the rental places there knew by your rank how much housing allowance you were going to get. And so they charged you exactly what they knew the amount was that you were going to get. Yeah, they had that all figured out. So we rented a 2-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a high-rise building, and you just looked out the lanai windows, and right up the hill was Tripler Army Medical Center. So even when I wasn't working there, I could see it. But I really enjoyed my time at Tripler. It was very interesting work. Of course, for me, a big medical center like that was unbelievable. And my first, or the unit that I worked at was a male general surgery urology floor. And then we also had some overflow with patients of plastic surgery and orthopedics. So there was a lot to learn. And the interesting thing about the Army at that time, I don't know if it's still like that, but when you start, you get about 3 weeks, 4 weeks max of, on-the-job training, and then you're charged. You can be assigned the charge nurse for your shift. It was a 35-bed ward, and there were 3 open bays of 4 beds here, 4 beds here, then a row of curtains. 4 beds here, 4 beds here, a row of curtains, and then another row of that. And then the hallway going the other direction was like 2 or 3 private rooms, and then a bed with, or a room with 6 beds with curtains in between. We always called that the 6-pack. And it was big. It was interesting. I met lots of interesting people, both as patients and as co-workers. I had 2 different head nurses during that time. And not only did we serve, all branches of the military, so you had to kind of try and learn what all the different ranks equaled in, the Army ranks, so you could know who you were talking to and that kind of thing. But, based on sight also, because you saw people with these different uniforms on, and knowing whether you needed to, if you were outside, whether you needed to salute them or not, or address them as sir or not, or ma'am, or, how to do all of that courtesy type stuff. And then we also did all the families of the military. We did any retired, and there's a lot of retired people living in Hawaii, retired military, any of their family. And then we also got flown into us people that were too sick to actually be kept, like in the Philippines, in Okinawa, Johnston Island, and then any of the Trust Territory islands, we took care of those people also. So you saw and met a large variety of people, which made it very interesting. Not only was the work interesting, but the things you learned about people and customs and, life in general. It was very, very interesting that way.
So what were your working hours like?
Most of the time it was 8-hour shifts, but at any time you could be called in, to pick up extra hours. You could, I remember one time when I was in Hawaii that I worked, how did that work? I worked a night, an evening shift. Then I had to come back to mornings the next day because of something that was going on. I don't remember what.
It was a rotating thing.
Pardon?
It was a rotating thing where you'd rotate from
Well,
one shift?
no, it was, I had to do it because I think I had a trainee that was coming in, and I had to meet them and get them, bring them to the unit, show them around, do the beginning of the shift with them, showing them things that they needed to do. And then at about 2 o'clock that day, my head nurse said, "Go home and get some sleep. I need you to work the night shift tonight." So, in a 30-hour period, I worked like a 36-hour period. I think I worked like 24 hours.
So you're a lieutenant. What rank is this head nurse?
Major?
Major?
Or lieutenant colonel.
Okay, all right.
Yes. So, and most of your doctors, especially because since it was a medical center, it was a training place for medical people also. So you had your surgical residents and that kind of thing. Most of your doctors were captains or higher. The doctors would usually come in as captain. And I got my first, after a year and a half or 2 years, I got my first promotion. And all of us that had gone to Hawaii at the same time from our basic training session all got promoted at the same time. So we had a big promotion ceremony together.
You first lieutenant then?
Yes, first lieutenant. And that promotion is pretty automatic unless you've screwed up pretty bad at some point in there. And there was 13 of us that went from my basic training class to Hawaii at that time. That when you sign up, they have you, put down your wish list of where you'd like to go. And I put down Hawaii as my first choice. I wanted that. And everybody said, "Don't put that down. You're never going to get it anyway." And I said, "Well, if I don't put it down, if I do or don't, what does it matter then?"
It's not like the military to give you your first choice.
Yeah, no kidding, no kidding. It just happened that they had a huge turnover at that time, and they needed a lot of people. We weren't all nurses. There were a couple of physical therapists, and I think a dietitian and things like that. But it was all medically related. So, yeah. So that was always to me kind of humorous that it worked out that way. But Dwight and I never really enjoyed living in Hawaii that much. Just it was so different. It was very racist. If you weren't Polynesian native, then they had like a caste system, and they didn't like tourists, and they didn't like military, which was the two big things that kept the Hawaiian Islands going and made them what they were to a certain extent. And then if you were, white and in the military, you were at this level. If you were Hispanic and in the military, you were at this level. If you were black and in the military, you were at this level. And it was just the way they treated people. It just, we weren't used to that from being around this part of the country. And so that part kind of got to us. The fact that you could drive 2 hours and you were around the whole island. You had to get on a plane or a boat to go anywhere else. I've always been kind of afraid of the water, so I didn't spend much time swimming or surfboarding and in fact, I've never tried surfboarding. Any of that kind of stuff, snorkeling. And to me, going and laying on the beach was just dirty. You got sweaty, you got full of sand. It just wasn't fun for me. So all the things that most people go there for and do, wasn't stuff that I really turned out really enjoyed. So that made it a little interesting also. And then just being so far away from my family was difficult for me. But Dwight and I found some places to go hiking and that kind of stuff. And so that made it a little better. We found some favorite spots that we like to go to visit. Not, having only a limited amount of time off period, because with the military, you are on call 24/7, 365. So you had to be available whenever they called you. Although back then you didn't have cell phones, so it wasn't quite as easy to get a hold of you as it is now. But it was an experience, and we've done several things throughout our lives, and partly because of the military and partly not.
How long were you in Hawaii?
Were experiences. We were in Hawaii for 3 years, and then I got transferred to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And while I was there, I worked the emergency room for 2 years. We had our first child while we were still in Hawaii, and then we had our second child when we were in Oklahoma. And I got my promotion to captain after we were in Oklahoma. And I remember it was kind of interesting because I was assigned to I can't even remember what unit it was, field unit. I was assigned to a field unit, but other than doing some training with them, you usually just worked in the hospital. But I had to do my initial in-processing and training with this field unit, and I knew I should be coming up for captain pretty soon. And my chief head nurse of the field unit had asked me something about that, because he figured I should be coming up for it too. And I said, I haven't gotten anything. And he said, well, I got a notice saying that you were not qualified because you didn't pass your last weight. And I said, well, I didn't pass my last weight, but I had an exception because I was still postpartum and I had time yet to get down to the weight I needed to get to. And he said, well, that shouldn't have deferred you. And I said, no. And then he said, well, did you carry your records with you, your personnel file and your medical records? And I said, yeah. Well, they wouldn't have let you do that if you were deferred. And I said, because I shouldn't have been deferred. So he did a little checking for me and found out that they had accidentally flagged the wrong record. There was a Major Scharmer or something like that, SCHO instead of SCHA. Her record was right behind mine. She was the one that hadn't passed weight. Hers was the one that was supposed to have been flagged. Once he got that straightened out for me, then I got my promotion to captain while I was in Fort Sill. So I worked emergency, like I said there. It's very interesting. You got close to the MPs that worked on post, partly because sometimes you needed to call them for help. But other times they brought in people that they were in the process of investigating or arresting who medically needed some attention before they could take them to the brig. So that was interesting to have to worry about that. Just did some really interesting medical things in the emergency room that I didn't realize got done there. Military emergency rooms tend to be different at that time than civilian ones because people just used it like their urgent care or their, regular clinic, even though they were assigned a clinic and a physician provider. When they first got there, a lot of times they just never go to them. They just take them to the emergency room because, it's the Army, it's covered. So
Kristi, what's the craziest thing you ever ran into in an emergency room?
In an emergency room?
Yep.
Craziest by what?
Craziest by somebody going nuts or something. I don't know. What's the craziest thing?
Yeah, we did a lot of holding people down. Sometimes what we had to do was, did I get too close when I shifted here?
Yeah, you did.
The better?
A little bit more. There you go.
All right. There were times when you had to take a litter. You know what a litter is?
Yep.
That you carry? Yeah. I figured you would, but I had to ask. You had to take a litter. People were so wild and crazy for various reasons, whether they were drunk, whether they were high, whether they were psychotic, and basically lay over the top of them on the ER cot you had them on and strap it down. That would never fly in this day and age, but that's the way it was done there. The MPs would have to come and help hold them down. I guess to me, the most, and it isn't necessarily crazy, but the most intervention I had to do one time was when I had a family member, I believe it was, come in from the waiting room to report that there was a lady out there who had slapped her daughter across the face. And I was the charge nurse at the time, so I had to go out, get the daughter, bring her back, call the MPs to come and get the mom, and just intervene in a situation like that. And that was something that was very uncomfortable for me because I hadn't run into things like that before. But you do what you have to do when the time comes. So that, to me, was one of the most interesting. And then the other thing that will stick with me for the rest of my life was the time that we had a guy come in CPR in progress, and he and his wife, and they had a young child, she was still an infant, had gotten in a fight over who was going to have to watch the kid. Because mom was going to go do laundry, and dad was going to go do something else, and they each thought the other one should take the kid with them. And the wife got upset and not only said no, but, expletive no, and took a knife and stabbed him in the chest.
Ouch.
So, yeah. So the ambulance brings him in, CPR in progress, and we're doing, continue CPR and giving the medications you usually give and try and figure out what all is going on. And I think he was 20 and she was 19. And I believe she was military also, the wife. And we're pouring blood into this guy, trying, because he's got blood, he's obviously bleeding somewhere. And we're pouring blood into him. And finally the doctor said, we're going to have to crack his chest. He must have the knife must have punctured the heart. So we had to open his sternum, and we did that, and we found where all the bleeding was because blood just poured out of him. And the doctor is feeling the heart, and he said, I found it. But then he's feeling a little bit more, and she had punctured all the way through his heart. There was an ingoing wound on the front and an outgoing wound on the back of his heart. And unfortunately, because of that, there was no saving this guy. We had no time to suture up, and no way to suture up a heart like that in an emergency room, and the surgeons wouldn't have been able to do it either. There just wasn't time. That was probably the craziest situation I had there. Very interesting from my perspective, because you learn so much. Very sad also from my perspective, just knowing the whole, or what we did of the story and how this came about and how it could have easily been avoided. That kind
Kristi,
of thing.
can I have you push the computer away from you again? Or move back? There you go. You were, top of your head was going out of sight there. Okay.
No, that's fine. Just let me know what I need to do. Because
Right.
like I said, I can't see you at all. I'm just talking to a sign that says Zoom.
Well, you're lucky for that part.
No, I want. It's easier to talk to a person than a computer. So, as my time there was coming to an end, my 2 years that I was assigned there, then we had decided I was going to get off active duty because, like I said, we had started a family in Hawaii, and I didn't really want to raise a family and continue traveling around the world. And I'd seen what my cousins had to do with my uncle, who stayed active for over 20 years. He's the one that commissioned me. He retired after like 21 or so years. He retired as a lieutenant colonel. But he, with all the moving and stuff and how you have to make new friends everywhere you go, you hardly ever have old friends that you run into, and sometimes you're out of country for 3 years. Sometimes you get assigned somewhere where you have to leave your family for a year or more. I just didn't want to go through that. And so we decided to get off active duty. And then I called up Dwight one day and I said, can we meet for lunch? And I was leaving work. They had agreed for me to do this. And so we met for lunch, and I looked at him and I said, I'm pregnant, and I just start bawling. And he's going, what's wrong? And I said, well, you know, we were going to leave the Army and now's not really a good time and I don't know what we should do. And he's going, you know, we'll figure this out, okay? This is a time to be happy. So I had just found it out at work that day, and it's like, oh my gosh, now all my plans, there's a, you know, but we had wanted the second child right after I had got stationed at Fort Sill. We had had a miscarriage, and so we wanted the second child. We just decided we'd stay in a few more months and have the baby while we were on active duty, and then after that, I would get off active duty. So that's what we did. And when it was time to get off active duty, then we talked about, okay, do I automatically go directly into the active reserve? Do I not do reserve? You know, what's our plan here? And I looked at him and I said, you know that if there was a war, I would volunteer anyway, because that's who I am. So are you okay with me going into the reserves? And he said that was fine. And he looked at it more as a, if you can stay in the reserves and get your retirement, there's that, you know, medical taken care of, that's that pension that you have. He's looking more to the future, which is what Dwight does, and does that kind of planning. And so we're looking at it from both ends. And I just decided that I would wait to go active in the reserve until the baby was a year old. After she was a year old, then it would be okay. And so he drove up from Oklahoma then to the Drayton area, looking around for a place to live, and found a place found some options. And then we had some family friends that were leaving to go down to Texas for the winter for the first time, and we would be getting home in December, late December, so they had us stay in their house. We needed a place to stay. They wanted somebody to watch their house for the winter. And so that worked out. And while we were transitioning, then he was able to find us a house, and we got moved into that then in April of '89. And it was right about the time we moved is when those people came back from Texas. So it worked out quite well. And we have been living in that house ever since. And Dwight has redid the original house down to the studs and back, redid the outside. He's landscaped tremendously. We've added on some, and Dwight has done a good portion of all that work himself. So during the time that I was on active duty, he, of course, would, each time, the times that we moved, would have to find us a place to live. Once we had the kids, find daycare, find himself a job, and go through all the fun things that the dependents always get to do. And, you know, it was difficult for him, especially if he had any trouble finding a job, because he's used to doing things. He's used to being busy. He likes, you know, providing for his family. And so he struggled once or twice, but we got through it. And then I went active duty or active reserve out of a medical unit in Fargo. So I'd have to drive about 115 to 120 miles one way to do drill. And that was, I went active with them October of '89. And then my first annual training with them was August of 90 then. It was at Gowanfield, Idaho. We were running a clinic for 2 weeks for, it's a site where a lot of the, what am I trying to say? Combat operations, do some training there. And so we ran like the clinic for the people to come in whenever they had issues. Most interesting thing there was the guy who sat on the cactus. He was a scout, and he was out at night and accidentally sat on a cactus. So we had to try and get all of these spines out of his behind. That was something we'd never really run into before. But while we are there, then things are heating up over in Iraq and Kuwait. And we're getting a little nervous because we thought we had been hearing things from back home that we might be getting activated. And we were afraid we weren't going to be able to get home and see our families before we had to be off somewhere else. But we did make it home. And then in September, I was working in Grafton at the time at the developmental center, and they have a water unit there. And the water unit got activated in September, and I went to their send-off. And then I went to where Dwight works because I needed a hug, because that was difficult, because I looked at him and I said, you know, this is going to be me sometime. And he said, yeah, I know. So it was December then, and I remember it very clearly. It was a cold winter's day, and there was bad wind chills and icy roads. And I had called in and said, I'm not coming to work today. I said, I am not taking my kids out in this weather to get them to the babysitter so I can go to work. Because it was 8 miles into Drayton to take them to the babysitter, and then I would have to come back and drive to Grafton, which would have been the 8 miles plus another 14. And she wasn't very happy, but she said, okay, I understand. And probably 2 hours later, like 10 o'clock that morning, I got a phone call. And we were being activated. And we were supposed to report to Fargo the day after Christmas. And so I called Dwight and told him. I called my parents. I'm going to start crying, and I don't know why. And I told my mom, I said, are you sitting down? And all she said was, when? Because she knew that meant I was going to have to go. And I said, December 26th. And she said, well, at least we got Christmas. So, that's the way I told them I was leaving. Anyway, then I called my boss that day and told her that what had happened, a specific day that I was coming in to get finish up some things at work. And then that was all. I was going to be coming back to work. And I was so thankful that I had not gone to work that day, because it gave me some extra time with my kids that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And of course, my coworkers had been told, I didn't want them to be told, but they kind of had to be, that I was coming in for a couple hours on this one particular day to finish up work and let them know what I needed them to complete for me and that kind of stuff. So, of course, they had a surprise going away party for me. They had a cake and all that kind of stuff. But we drove out to Mohall because we were going to have Christmas Eve day with Dwight's family. That had already been planned, and so we drove out there and did Christmas Eve day with them because his sister lives in Tioga, his brother lives in Mohall, and then his mom lives in Drayton, so we just took her with us. And then we drove back Christmas morning and then drove out to my parents. And we had decided, or we had made arrangements with them that when we left their house, we would leave the kids with them. And we would come back home, grab my gear, because I had it pretty much all packed up. And then we would go to Fargo together. And so Christmas Day, I not only said goodbye to my parents and my brother, but to my kids. The oldest one was 4 and the youngest one was 2. And my orders said 6 months, but we knew that could be amended. And so we had told the 4-year-old to help her understand a little bit. We just told her that mommy was going to be gone all the pages of the calendar. Just to give her, we made it longer than what my order said, and to give her a little more of an idea, of time. It was all the pages of the calendar. So, I'm sorry, I have to run and get a Kleenex. My nose is starting to run. So we grabbed my stuff, we went to Fargo, I reported, or they were expecting to have families stay in Fargo with the troops for 2 days, I believe it was, until we got all of our in-processing there done, and headed out to Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. We stayed the night in Fargo, and we get to the drill center, and Dwight says, "I'm going home today." And he said, it's just going to make it harder if I stay here for the next 2 days. So let's say our goodbyes now. So we did, and I walked into the drill hall just bawling. And one of my mentors there, sees me and, "Are you okay?" And I explained what happened, and so they understood. But that was a tough day. I understood his reasoning. It didn't make me feel any better, but I understood. So, like I said, it was about 3 days. No, we reported there on the 26th. On the 31st, New Year's Eve day, I believe, is when we drove to Fort McCoy. And we got there, and then you have to do more in-processing, of course, and some training. And they did, a little bit more NBC training there because you still had to, wasn't Cold War, but you still have to worry about that kind of stuff. And then they had us do some field training. They had a specified number of people that did weapons qualifications. Just a few officers were given pistols, and then there were some of the enlisted that had the rifles to be able to pull guard duty, is what it amounted to. And then, but of course, being medical, you're not supposed to carry weapons, so that's why they limited the number of people who actually had weapons. And it was interesting because we were supposed to be doing, my words are escaping me right now. compass course in Wisconsin in the middle of winter in the woods and pretend it was in the sand dunes of the desert.
Map orientation.
Yes. And so that was interesting. The most interesting thing about it was that one of the people that had been assigned to us to help fill out our needs for the unit in order to activate was a 19-year-old kid from somewhere in California. He'd never seen snow before. And we're doing, compass course out in the woods, map orientation, in thigh-deep snow. So to him, this was really interesting. He was having a lot of fun. When we, set the next point that we were going for, he was just running. He wasn't counting steps or, that kind of thing. He was just running because he thought it was so much fun out there. But that made that course a little bit more interesting and entertaining, I could tell you that. So, and let's see. Those are the main things I remember. Fort McCoy was at the time, still had a lot of old World War II barracks that were heated on coal. So we were all getting coal lung from all this training we had to do outside and, sucking all this coal dust and coal soot into our lungs. But, so it's wide open barracks. It's the bathrooms that have 3 seats lined up right next to each other and open showers. And you got some people who, I grew up in the country with an outdoor toilet until I was 8 years old. So to me, this was not a really big deal, but to some people it really was. But that was just interesting to see how some of the stuff hadn't been updated through the years. I believe now things have been improved, but let's see, we got our assignment, but only a few people, knew what that was. We got the date we were leaving, so I called Dwight, I called my mother-in-law, I called my parents and told them we'll be flying out on this date. I can't tell you where because I don't know where, but we will be going overseas. And let's see, I get my dates all mixed up because of the international date line and that kind of thing, but we were in air when the air war started. And for the last, I don't know how many hundreds of miles, we had military escort into country. And we went to Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And so we got there, and it was interesting to find out that in the city of Abu Dhabi, they were building 2 new hospitals. This was just a few years before. And the one in the city got built first, so the military took that. And the one out in the desert got built second, so all of the city people had to travel out to the one at the desert, to see their doctors. And that just seemed, a little bit strange to us, but, you deal with it. And then Moth Rock Hospital was the name of the hospital we got assigned to. And it was the civilian one. And we were supposed to be staying there and working with their people. And there was just one portion of the hospital we were going to be taking over and using for military casualties as needed. We were trying to think. I was with the 311th Evacuation Hospital at the time, and so we were like the last line of medical in country, and then we would take them. Anybody that had to be transferred, like to Germany or wherever, would be taken to one of the nearby airfields that were there and loaded and sent to Germany. So it wasn't quite the kind of mission we were expecting, because we trained more for a closer to the fighting line site. But we ended up at this local hospital, and so they said we had oh God, I'm not going to remember this wording either.
That's okay. Just go on.
Yeah. Our mission was also public relations, because we were dealing with the local people. And some people are going, well, I like that idea, we're not out in the middle of the desert, we've got some comfort things around. And I went, I don't like that. I don't want to deal with all the different customs and stuff. But, you take what you're assigned. And so for the first 3 or 4 days, they housed us within the hospital, in the area that we were going to be using for our troops, until they could get the camp set up next to the hospital. And then they made us wear civilian clothes because they didn't want anybody to know there was a military presence there. And I went, what? This makes no sense, because we have a camp behind fenced wire with guard towers at the corners. How can you say there's no military presence here? It just didn't make sense to me. But whatever. But also that meant we couldn't keep our gas masks with us, because, that would show that there was something going on. And we were actually within Scud range. And so that unnerved me a little bit too. It made me feel like we were expendable. But such is life. I mean, there's nothing like the shock of getting ready to get on an airplane and being handed full, still in the package, mop gear and your EpiPens to use in case of attack. That's when you really understand where you're going to, as a medical person, anyway.
You're going to have to back up, Kristi.
So,
Thank you. How long were you there?
So we were actually there only like 2.5 months. We actually were one of the later ones in and one of the early ones out. We think partly because we were over 400, over a 400-person unit. So money-wise, it was expensive. And they didn't want to give us that 90-day window where you're then supposedly eligible for more benefits and stuff. I don't understand all that either. But we did eventually start wearing our uniforms. We did eventually get a few casualties. We really didn't get a lot, but in the meantime, we helped out the local people in the local hospital. So we met, some people that spoke no English. A lot of the people that worked there were actually like from the Philippines or from the nearby African countries that would come and work there because they'd get paid well, and they wouldn't have to, or then they could send their money home to their families. And also, in the United Arab Emirates, everybody that is from that area, that is a native emirate, was given a monetary stipend yearly to live on. So they could hire in all of their workers from out of country. And that's usually what they did. And so most of the workers that we dealt with spoke English and Arabic, because they had learned Arabic once they got over there. But it was interesting. We learned a few words of Arabic. We learned how to read some of the numbers. We learned how to, what am I trying to say? What some of their customs were that we had to be careful of. We learned, about people's lives back in the countries that they originally came from. And just some of the differences in the medical stuff that goes on. I mean, their medical system was like 40 years behind ours. They would cut up dressings for Band-Aids. They still had just regular needles that you had to sharpen. They didn't know how to do CPR. They had all this great equipment that they didn't know how to use. They had stockpiled like medical gloves that you use. They had stockpiled a warehouse full of them, and they had had some of them so long that they were falling apart. They were no good anymore. You just took wads of cotton and pulled them up to make cotton balls. It was just really, really different because it was so almost primitive compared to what we were used to in the United States.
A little backward, huh?
Yeah, a little bit backward. And, there were places where you had the hole in the floor to go to the bathroom. You didn't have a real bathroom. It got to be where it was kind of dangerous to go off our base and into the city, especially if you were female and without escort, because some people were being accosted by males and different things that happened to different people. So they eventually said, if you're going into town, you have to have this many males for this many females. You have to have an escort. And that just kind of eased things a little bit, except for the times when your escorts were being inappropriate too. But we won't get into that. I remember using my rank one time. And it was people that should have known better. They were just being silly, and it turned into something a little worse than it could have been. But it was interesting to see their souk, or their local market, all the gold, and the way they sold their meat, the way they did their fish, the way they transacted business, and just to drive through the town and see the way people lived, and the buildings or lack thereof that they lived in, and that kind of thing, the way they dressed, because there were many varying styles of dress based on which type of Muslim religion you followed and how strict their codes may or may not be. So that was interesting. And but anyway, then it was time to come home, and I remember when we got to New York and we had time to get off the plane and mill around a little bit just to stretch your legs and stuff. And I remember we got to New York, and all of a sudden I just started bawling. And somebody's going, "What's the matter?" And I said, "I don't know. I guess I just didn't believe we were really coming home until we got here." because they can change things at the drop of a hat in the military, and it just, you never know if what you're told is what's really going to happen. And so that was kind of interesting. So we went back to Fort McCoy, and that's where we did our out processing. And we got, they did that in actually like 3 days, which was really, 2 or 3 days, which was really fast for the military. They got us out processed and got us back home. Well, my unit had branches in Fargo, Bismarck, and Minot. We had different sections, and so you got on separate buses when you left Fort McCoy, and each bus went to each town. So we got back to Fargo, and there was a welcome home program there, and our families met us there. And I had mentioned to Dwight that this one friend I had made from our unit while I was over there, as they were wondering if we wanted to go out to eat with them. And Dwight said, no, I think we'll just go home. What I didn't know was that back at our house, waiting, were my parents, my grandmother, my goddaughter, and my mother-in-law. We had a family welcome home ceremony here. And
Surprise one.
so that was part of the reason we had to get home. But there were other people that had wanted to do that, and they had talked to a friend of mine, and the friend said, no, Dwight wouldn't like that. Just let them keep it private, and we can always do something later. But and I appreciated that very much, because I don't know that that's what I wanted too. The big program in Fargo was more than enough, and trying to find your families in that mess of people was like nigh impossible. I had seen Dwight and the girls standing outside as the buses drove up, holding signs. But then when I get off, they're going in a different direction from where we're going, and so then everybody's stopping as they find their families, and you're trying to get through this mess of people. And I made it all the way through to the back. I couldn't find anybody. And my dad's cousin, who lived in Fargo, was standing up in a balcony area, and she yelled my name, and she pointed, they're over there, they're over there. So I went back that way, and the first person I found was my brother, and he was holding our oldest daughter. And we got a big hug, and our oldest daughter, Lane, is just bawling now. She's just sobbing, and I'm holding her by now, and I'm like, honey, what's the matter? And she said, you were supposed to be gone all the pages of the calendar. And I said, I know we said that, honey, but I didn't have to be. Isn't that good? Yes. And my brother was crying, and I said, it's okay, I'm home, it's okay. And then they helped me get me back to where the rest of the family was. And his wife was there, and they didn't bring their kids. It was just him and his wife that came, and then Dwight and our girls that were there. So, you have to stand and wait till everything's over, and then it was time to go home. And I was back. I took about a week off before I went back to work, and then the kids had a little bit of a hard time adjusting. Some friends from work had wanted me to meet them one evening to go out for supper, and so I had agreed to do that. But when it was time for me to leave, the kids are, just hanging on and crying, and I said, so I sat them down and I said, are you afraid mommy's going to go and not come back for a long time? And they said yes. And I said, honey, I told you the last time before it happened, right? And they said yes. And I said, I would tell you again if that was going to happen. And I said, I will be back tonight, but it will be after you're in bed. So I will come down and give you a kiss when I get home, but you won't see me until the morning. And so that was hard, but we got through that also, and things slowly improved as time went on. It was interesting when you would meet people, and people who knew you'd been in the military and had gone, and thank you for your service and that kind of thing. But then I had a couple of older ladies. I think I had given a talk at work to a group of people, and a couple of older ladies met me in the hallway, and they said, you were the one that was in Desert Storm? And I said, yeah. How could you? How could you do that? How could you leave those children? And I just said, it was my job. It was my duty. And I had a husband that I knew was capable of taking care of our kids. So I was able to do it. And I just let it go at that. Then I spent the next 15 years, well, I suppose it'd be 14 after that, with the unit in Fargo. They eventually deactivated the 311 and made us into the 4226th U.S. Army Hospital, and completed my tour. In order to get my next promotion, I was a major by this time. I had been promoted after Desert Storm. I don't even remember what year I got promoted to major. And in order to get my lieutenant colonel, I either had to get a master's degree in something or get Command and General Staff College. And Command and General Staff was real difficult to do in this area. They just didn't hold the classes very much at that time. For you to go on a site and do it, you could do it online, or you could get assigned and go away for 6 months, I think it was, and do that training at an active post that held Command and General Staff College. And I'm not good at doing things online or correspondence course. I had tried that with one course and I barely made it through. So I didn't want to do it that way. Plus I had some friends who had in my unit that had started doing that I felt were much better prepared for it than I would be, and they struggled. In fact, one of them just dropped out within weeks because she wasn't able to, they weren't accepting the papers the way she had written them. And so I just wasn't going to do that. And I never really wanted to get a master's degree. I was a bedside nurse, and that's the kind of nursing I liked, and a master's degree did me no good. So there was, because in most places you work, it didn't get you a pay raise or anything. So I wasn't going to go through that process. And I knew I could make my full 20 years as a major, even if I didn't get my promotion. So I just completed my 20 years and retired. So then, of course, when you retire out of the Guard or the reserves, you wait till you're 60 years old before you get your pension and your medical, and that's what I did. I just continued working as a nurse. I still work as a nurse, hoping to completely retire in the next year or so and go on from there.
Sounds like a long career, Kristi. You did a good job.
Yeah, it was.
Yep.
Yes. With the reserves, you do the 2 weeks, 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks during the year. And then, of course, as I was a major and was getting more responsibilities, I had to do some, I had to fly to Salt Lake a couple of times for like meetings or classes or, updates on things, that kind of stuff. But while I was still early, shortly after Desert Storm, I did the CASQ, Combined Arms and Services Staff School. And that was one of the things I needed to get my major. And I did that one because I could do that as the class. We did our weekend duty for the first 8 months, I think it was, instead of going to Fargo then. I would drive to Bismarck and attend the CASCUBE class. And then our 2-week training was out in Pocatello, Idaho to complete the course.
Okay, Kristi, I'm going to have to change battery here, so
Okay.
can you hang on?
I finished CASCUBE, Combined Arms and Services Staff School. That was very interesting. I did it with one other female. All the rest were males, and they were in like water units or combat units or things along those lines. And so that was very interesting to learn the staff side of things as far as how that worked. I actually, because of my rank, I ended up being the commanding officer of the class, basically. And the instructor gave me the option of not doing that because of my medical background and not having any background in being on a staff. And I said, as long as I can get, somebody to advise me and help me with my questions and stuff, we might as well try it. So I did. I had a really good XO, and he was very helpful to me. And we made it through. And so I got some, really good training on medical and military things while I was in the military. While I was on active duty, I did the, it was called the C4 course, Combat Casualty Care course, which brings you in more into how to treat actual combat casualties. You had to go to Fort Sam Houston to do it. And we did some really interesting things like, and I don't know if they still do this anymore, but we worked on animals in a couple of instances. So we never really knew how to get to the place where we did this because it was kept fairly secret because they had so many protesters and people that would try and break in and let the animals free and that kind of stuff. In one instance, there was they had a goat, and they gave the goat a gunshot wound. And we learned how to intubate, how to treat an actual gunshot wound, how to do some of that stuff. That was very interesting. How to do what's called a thoracentesis or a pluricentesis, where you have to, put the needle into the lung to help it expand again, and where exactly you do that. And so some of that stuff was really interesting. I also remember that, of course, they took us out to the field for a couple of days. And what they did was, and you lived in the tents and you roomed with your squad. And so we had all the guys on one end, and there was only 2 of us girls in this squad too. And so there was 2 empty cots on each side, and then the girls. So that was the barrier between the guys and the girls. And we just lived together. And what they did was they brought in a squad of Marines from 29 Palms, California, to come in and interact with us on escape and evasion techniques. And what was the other stuff? Well, it was like you were pretending that you were actively in combat, and then other people would bring up the litter to try and take the injured away, and how that whole scenario would work, like almost like being a combat medic as opposed to a nurse or a doctor. And so that was very interesting, and learning more about how to triage your patients to get them to the sites they needed to go depending on the type of injuries they had. So it was more like the doctors could be certified in this course because it was like a trauma course, The nurses couldn't be certified, but we could be qualified because we had the training. We just couldn't be certified because there were certain things that we wouldn't have been allowed to do because of our licenses. So that was one of the best courses that I ever went to. That was really interesting. And of course, you had people from all across the military that were there. I actually had a couple dentists in my unit at the time. And that was interesting because I hadn't heard how, when the barracks was bombed in Beirut, and they had, 200 and some injured or something like that, one of the only doctors that was immediately available to help triage and care for these patients was actually a dentist. And so I found that interesting. But we had heard that these Marines were going to come in from 29 Palms, so we're sleeping in our tent, and all of a sudden there's rifles going off, gunfire going off outside our tents, and people yelling and hollering and screaming, and this was our introduction to being out in the field with the Marines.
Okay.
So I learned a lot. I will never, the only thing I will regret about my time in the military is the time it took away from my family.
Right.
And I didn't realize just what my kids had gone through until I got the call that told me my retirement papers came in. And my daughters and I, they were in high school by this time. My oldest daughter would have been in her senior year, so our younger daughter was in her freshman year. And we're walking into a volleyball tournament in Park River. And I got this phone call, and I got off the phone call and I said, well, I'm officially retired. My papers came in. And our younger daughter looked at me and said, well, now I don't have to worry every time the phone rings.
Yeah.
But she had never said anything like that before.
Yeah. Kristi, I don't want to cut you short here, but I got another interview coming up.
Yes, yeah.
Do you have anything else you need to add, or would like to
I
add?
don't think so. I've done a lot of talking here, so.
I want to thank you for doing this interview, and thank you for your service, for your long
Well,
service.
thank you for doing this job.
You bet.
And thank you for your service also.
Thank you.